What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Perhaps. Today's episode will be a really, really interesting one because today's Good Friday. And I promise you, I'm going to make you think about Good Friday in a way that you'd never have before. I know that's a big promise, but I think I can deliver. I almost didn't do an episode today. And then I got to writing some of my thoughts I've been having lately about Good Friday and the crucifixion of Jesus and the nature of reality and Jesus on the cross saying, "Father, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing," and what that really means and the concept of the self and do we really know what we're doing? And it just took me to a lot of interesting places. And when I got done writing, I'm like, oh, this is the podcast. And so I have a lot of notes here that I'm going to be looking at a lot. The listeners won't be able to tell, but the people watching the video, you're probably used to me by now, not like just, having a hard time keeping eye contact with the lens. That's just how I am. It's all good. Y'all get me. I appreciate you. But yeah, it's been a few weeks, by the way, real quick. I'm good. It's just that it's been kind of a lot leading up to me releasing my book. It comes out June 23rd called You Don't Need a Calling. Go pre-order that. Link in the description. And just, getting prepared for it, trying to make different connections with people to try to promote the book and try to write stuff to promote the book. A bunch of stuff that I'm planning, and I want to make sure everything goes right. And the stress of it all takes away motivation to do the things that I need to be doing, and therefore it makes it even harder. I'm dealing with it. I'm good. I appreciate y'all's support, and I really appreciate everyone who's already pre-ordered the book. I can't wait for you all to read it. I've been waiting a while. I finished that thing back in July of last year. I'm so ready for you all to read it, and I know some of you can't wait, and I appreciate it. And yeah, today's Good Friday. We do episodes on Friday usually. Falls on Good Friday. And I'm glad we're here. It's actually really late. Like I said, I wasn't going to do an episode. It's 2 a.m. from the previous Thursday night. And so it's Good Friday right now. I'm with y'all. Let's get into this. Today's episode is called The Illusion of Knowing What You're Doing. A Good Friday message. I'm excited for this one. And before we get to Jesus saying, "Forgive them, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing," I want to give some context here. Some really important context to what got Jesus on that cross. Now, some of you may have heard me talk a lot about this before, about the violence of the Roman Empire that led to Jesus on the cross, which is usually not what people talk about in their Good Friday messages at church. Maybe you never heard about the context of the Roman Empire in any sermon at any church your whole life. But for me, that's really important to understanding who Jesus was and what he was talking about and the actual message of his teachings. And so we're going to get into that. First, let me say, one time, many years ago, I went to Unitarian Universalist Church for the first time. Unitarian Universalists started because it was some Christian Unitarians and some Christian Universalists who had pretty different beliefs than what the traditional Christians were believing at the time, decided to come together and said, let's be non-traditional together. And then over time moved beyond Christian, not just traditional Christianity, but Christianity, and now welcome all religions and teach from all religions. They're pretty cool people. And so I visited a church because I wanted to see what it was like. And I met a guy there who said he used to be a Lutheran. And some of the people who end up at churches like this end up there because they're tired of Christian churches. And this guy said that he was tired of his old church that just used to always focus on the death of Jesus and not much else, not the life of Jesus. And he loved his new church because they actually talked about the life of Jesus. And that really resonated with me, and it's always stuck with me, because I relate to that frustration. For some of you, Christianity is like all about the death of Jesus and nothing else. And now, as my faith has evolved through my own growth and learning and life experience and connections I've made with different people, now my faith is all about the life of Jesus. In fact, so much so that now I see the death of Jesus also as more really about the life of Jesus. Now I see the death of Jesus was a consequence for the type of life Jesus lived. And you may be used to churches who just preach about how the death of Jesus was just why he came in the first place. Like this whole thing was just about him dying on the cross to make some cosmic transaction between humans and God, to wipe away the debt that God had against humans so that we could be reconciled with God. That is a theological development that comes hundreds of years after the death of Jesus and after the beginning of the church. Many hundreds of years. But what we can see in the early church and even in the Gospels themselves is that there was definitely an understanding that this is about the life of Jesus. And this is what happens when you live the type of life Jesus lived. It wasn't just about getting Jesus to die on a cross. Jesus had years of ministry before that, and Jesus gathered disciples to teach them to live as he lived. And the life of Jesus was devoted to radical love and care and healing and community. And he taught his disciples to live the same way. And this life he lived was in the context of the Roman Empire, who was devoted to violence, control, exploitation, division, and doing everything they can to build more wealth and power. And they crucified Jesus on a cross as a particular style of execution that was only reserved for people who rebelled against the Roman government. They tortured him for hours and put him on a cross on a hill for everyone to see, so that everyone could see what happens to people who stand up against Rome. And everyone else who claimed to be the Messiah in this time period was also put on a cross as an execution for rebellion against Rome. Because everyone who claimed to be the Messiah was talking about ushering in the rule of God or the kingdom of God, which implies an ushering out of the kingdom of Caesar. And so for everyone else who claimed to be the Messiah and were crucified, how it usually went down is that the followers saw their Messiah crucified, and then they went home and decided they were wrong about who the Messiah was and waited for another. But the difference in the Jesus story is that he was crucified and his followers went home. But instead of deciding they were wrong about who the Messiah was, they decided they were wrong about what the Messiah is. And they started talking about being the body of the Messiah, or the Greek version, the body of Christ. And they were saying that they're filled with the same spirit that Jesus had. They're saying they're the body of God in the world, God's hands and feet in the world, in community together, continuing the life of Jesus. And people have always debated over what made them change their mind. Some people say it was Jesus literally, physically coming back from the dead and meeting with them, and that's what made them change their mind, to see themselves as the body of Christ. Others say that they saw visions of Jesus, and that's what the Gospels are describing. Other people say, actually, maybe it was more like they were just discussing this over years, and that's what changed their mind. And what made them change their mind isn't as important to me as the conclusion they came to and how that conclusion made them live differently. Because if I were to say, I believe in a literal physical resurrection that happened to Jesus. He physically resuscitated. Or if I were to say, no, I think maybe it was more like a metaphor or something. Both versions of that is just a thought in my head. It doesn't change how I live. And we know a lot of people with the thought in their head of physical resuscitation, but aren't living the resurrection, are living very different than how Jesus lived. In fact, very opposite of how Jesus lived, like the Christian nationalists that we see today. They're so unlike Jesus that all the non-Christians fully see it. So yeah, I'm all about resurrection, but for me, it's more about how we live than like a doctrine that we affirm and check a box. And Jesus didn't say he came to die on a cross. In Luke 4, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And Jesus' focus on the oppressed is crucial to understanding Jesus, especially when you realize he spent all of his time with the oppressed. And he took the position of the most oppressed, being arrested and executed as a criminal. And when you understand that aspect of Jesus, you can see that living like Jesus then means choosing the side of the oppressed like Jesus did, and being committed to the liberation of the oppressed like Jesus talked about. And so I think of the people who are oppressed today. Palestinians are still being displaced and genocided by the Israeli government. The people of Iran who are suffering for the pointless war that we're in, suffering from the attacks of the U.S. and Israeli military. I think about Muslims in the U.S. who are experiencing discrimination because the U.S. needs to spread Islamophobia to justify attacking Muslims on the other side of the world. And I think of immigrants in the U.S. who are being demonized and hunted and imprisoned in detention camps with no legal process. And I think of the people, all people who are in prisons right now. Those are the people that Jesus was talking about when he said that the Spirit has anointed me to set release to the captives. That wasn't just a spiritual captivity. He meant that one literally. And I think of all working class people in the United States who are increasingly finding it harder and harder for life to be affordable and are being punished by our awful economic policies that punish the poor and reward the rich again and again and again, becoming worse and worse and worse. And we're all looking around at all the suffering in the world and feeling powerless. And in that context, we must remember Jesus is on the side of the oppressed. He even said he is the oppressed. He said, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you did for me." The poor, the hungry, the sick, the prisoners. Jesus is all of them. All of them. And so on this Good Friday, I'm especially thinking about Jesus on the cross. In Luke 23, Jesus says that he says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And now, at this point of the episode, it's going to get deeper and also a little weird, but stick with me. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about the concept of the doer. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. What even is the doer? The part of us that makes choices to do things. And I mean basic things like lifting my hand. Not just big decisions, but the little actions we do in every single moment. And the idea of the doer is tied to the idea of the self. We typically think of ourselves as an individual self who chooses to do things. But in reality, the idea of the individual self is kind of made up. Like the individual, permanent, unchanging self that is me. Kind of made up. Some religious traditions, and even some neuroscience, would say that it's completely made up. And they would say like it's just an illusion where we interpret the world as separate objects. And through that perception, we also interpret the source of that perception as a separate object. And then we call it the self. We call it me. But that's interesting. And I'm not going to go all the way deep on that. I'm not interested in convincing you of that extreme of a perspective, even though I definitely am sympathetic to it. What I'm more interested in is getting you to a place where we can at least soften the idea that we have of this strict boundary of the individual self. I think that's a good direction. In the Advaita Vedanta tradition of Hinduism, they'd argue that separation is completely an illusion and that reality itself is one. And we all share one being together as one self. In Buddhism, they would argue that there is no self. They would take it a step further and say that actually all of reality is emptiness and there's no person or object that is separate from that. Also, there are many Christian mystics that made it their mission to achieve union with God through prayer and contemplation. And they thought through that process that they can dissolve the individual will. And they believed eventually through that, the individual will would be replaced by just the will of God and nothing else. And I think those Western Christian mystics were getting at something similar that these Eastern traditions were discovering when they're saying that the individual self was always just an illusion. It's almost like there's a part of these Christian mystics that knew that, but just formulated the idea differently and felt that they needed to defeat the individual self. I mean, that's how you get some of these mystics whipping their back, self-flagellating, because they're trying to reach that process where that individual self can go away. And maybe that impulse to see it that way was rooted in a feeling like this isn't it. This isn't real. I don't think I'm as separate from everything else as it seems. And I think each of us have a bit of that feeling. Like I said, you don't have to believe all the way that the individual self is not a thing. But I think we all have a feeling that we may not be as separate as we think. Separate from everything around us and everyone around us. Like I said, I think it's a good direction to go wherever we end up in the end. It's a good direction to soften that idea of the disconnected individual self. And so that perspective that I've been thinking a lot about. Also, I get into this perspective in my book that's coming out in June. And the very first chapter, I get really deep into it. So that's also why I've been thinking about this for a few years. And so I wrote about it in there. If you want to go deeper, go check that out, chapter 1 in the book. But I wanted to give a very, very brief idea of that perspective and say, today I was thinking about that in the context of Jesus on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Kind of gives me a different perspective. Also, they've done experiments where they analyze people's brains when they make decisions. They told them to raise their left hand or raise your right hand. You make the decision. Or they'll say, use your right hand or your left hand to press this button. And they can see unconscious activity in the brain where that would light up when they took the action. And they could see activity in the brain where they become aware of the choice that they're making. And the awareness of their choice occurred roughly 500 milliseconds after their action in the brain began. kind of weird stuff. And by watching this brain activity, the scientists were able to predict the choices that people would make up to 11 seconds before they made the choice, before they're conscious of making the choice. I don't really know what to do with that. I'm sure a lot of you don't really know what to do with that. Some people will look at that and say, look, see, free will is a complete illusion. And you can look at it like that. But whatever you believe about free will, determinism, and all the different flavors of that, I think we can agree at the very least that the decisions we make are not just based on an individual disconnected self making decisions. There's something more going on. Our brains and our bodies are always in a state of process. And the processes that make up our body are entangled with all kinds of processes going on all around us. One could even say that, like if you're having a hard time understanding, like, well, if there isn't a self, if there isn't like a literal individual self, a literal separate me, like that, then what is this? What is the source of this perception? One could say, within the context of this idea of process, interrelated, entangled processes, one could say that the body isn't a separate object, but is simply one intersection of interrelated processes. That's the source of this perception that we have. This is just an intersection of, you could even say an intersection of energy right here. And with that in mind, like I said, you don't have to buy into all of this. I just think this is good to think about to go in a good direction. And with all that in mind, I want to actually go even deeper and even weirder. Okay? Are you ready? At this point of the episode, I'm sure many people have already tuned out because they weren't really about it. But the people who stick around, I know you all can handle it. And so I appreciate you all. This is the real, perhaps, listeners right here. The real homies. I've also been thinking about this concept from the physicist and philosopher Karen Barad, who talks about agency and her theory that she calls agential realism. Like agency, agential realism, which is very complicated, very complex, super duper academic. I can understand parts of it, and I'm only going to give a very brief description of it and try my best to explain it. I think I got a pretty good explanation, but if you find yourself feeling like the way I explain it is too complex, trust me, the way I'm about to explain it is so much more simplified. I worked really hard to simplify this than what you'll find in the source of this stuff. But I find it super fascinating. I'm a nerd, but let's talk about this. When you look at the world at a microscopic level, because Karen Barad's agential realism is partly inspired by Niels Bohr, quantum physicist, and trying to take some of the ways that Niels Bohr talked about stuff in quantum physics and apply it to a larger context. So that's what we're talking about, the microscopic level. At a microscopic level, at the atomic level, the particle level, objects aren't as separate as we perceive them. All these particles that make up all these seemingly separate objects are all entangled together. What Niels Bohr and other quantum physicists figured out is that when they measured a particle, the way they measured that particle and the devices that they used to measure the particle changed how the particle behaved. And this is where quantum physics gets really weird and so complicated. And I do not understand quantum physics. A lot of spiritual teachers out there try to say they understand it. And this little weird part of quantum physics, like a particle changing the way it behaves when you observe it, has led to a lot of people taking this idea and spiritualizing it and saying that this proves their teachings on manifestation and stuff like that. I don't like that. Like, I think people need to stay in their lane and not and a lot of those people are just completely butchering quantum physics. But anyway, that's a side tangent. And I'm not doing that. Okay? Stick with me though. So the particle will change how it behaved depending on how they observed it and the devices they used to measure it. And this wasn't like the particle choosing to change how it to behave differently or getting nervous because it knows it's being watched or something. But what they discovered was that the measurement devices were part of the results. It changed the results because what they discovered is that you can't actually separate the particle and all the particles that it's entangled with. Particles aren't tiny solitary objects that can interact with other solitary objects or not. A particle is inseparable from everything that it's always been entangled with. So when we measure a particle, we're making our own cut between particles, but that cut isn't an actual cut. The cut only exists in the measurement. We're choosing a small part of the inseparable whole and calling it an object, a particle, a thing separate from other things. But that's only through our observation and how we're making that observation. So Karen Barad, physicist and philosopher, took this concept of the cuts we make when we measure particles and applied that to all of reality. All of reality is made up of what we perceive as separate objects, but in reality exists in an inseparable relationship. The separation between objects that we perceive isn't a pre-existing separation between separate objects. We make the separation by distinguishing between two things that are interconnected. When we interpret something as a separate object, we are focusing on one part and ignoring everything it's connected to. So in the same way that the way we would measure something influences the thing we're measuring, the way that we perceive something, observe something, influences what we're perceiving or observing. So, an object and its environment exists through their relationship. Even people like you and me and our environment, each other, the ground, the trees, the building, every particle entangled with every other particle, and us and all the particles that make us what we would call us, all exist through relationship. All these particles that make up our body and our environment are inseparable. You still with me? Because we're about to go further. Taking that concept even further, we can look at the level of how we act. How we act is inseparable from all the other actions happening that influence our actions. All the actions happening inside our body and happening in other people's body and happening in nature all exist in relationship. And that isn't to say that decisions aren't real, but the decisions you make are in relation to all kinds of other actions happening. I think we could all see that in every decision we make. So this, from this perspective, this is where we get into agency. Agency isn't something an individual person or thing has. Agency emerges from relationship. And we determine agency based on how we make a cut in reality to claim that this object is a separate object and this separate object took this action. And so Karen Broad calls these cuts agential cuts. But where we make that cut, where we make that agential cut, is a choice. Here's an example. If a person hits another person, where do we make that cut to determine agency? Do we make that cut at that person's hand? The hand did it. Usually no. Do we make that cut at the perceived boundaries of a person's body and say their body did it? Usually no. Do we make the cut at the person's personality and distinct identity in a group of other humans? Sometimes. We say this person whose name so-and-so did it. But usually we go bigger than that. We ask what was happening in the situation. What led up to the hit? Was it random? Was it in self-defense? Did they know each other? Was there another important action that took place before the hit that can help us understand? What else was happening? And when we ask these questions, we're widening where we make the cut to determine agency. Do you see that? For many people, that's as wide as they're willing to go. They say this person with their distinct identity and personality did it. But for a lot of people, when it comes to determining agency, they go even wider than that. If there was a court case with lawyers and a judge and a jury, they would go wider than that. They may ask about the person's psychological state. That's a lot wider if we're talking about agency. Because not only are we getting into a person's psychology and biology, we're also getting into a person's history. And when we get into their history, we're also asking about all types of other interactions throughout their life that led to this one action. And perhaps as the jury is hearing this person out and hearing them talk about their life, they may even be wondering about how this person was raised and how their environment, both past and present, affected this person and their action. And then what if we find out that this person was conditioned by their environment, for example, to hit someone every time they feel disrespected? And in this situation, they felt disrespected. That's widening the cut for where we determine agency even more. But we could just make the cut at the person and their actions and say, well, they made that choice that day to hit someone, and that's all the agency that matters in this case. And that's fine. And we'd be correct. But at the same time, we would know that's not the full story. So if we want to have a bigger conversation about agency, we need to talk about the whole environment and how it influences our actions, and even the way that it influences the way we judge those actions. And so Karen Broad widens this perspective beyond the individual. We're going even further here and looks at how institutions make agential cuts. When the court system convicts someone, they're making a cut and saying, this is where the harm begins and this is where the harm ends. And this is where the person's agency begins, and this is where it ends. Choosing to ignore the wider agency at play. Also, when the healthcare system diagnoses someone, they're making a cut. They're drawing a boundary around a set of symptoms and diagnosing those symptoms as a specific condition, and then treating just those specific symptoms. Choosing to ignore how their symptoms interact with everything else going on in their body and everything else going on in their environment and their life experience and how all of that works together. I'm sure you've experienced this, where somebody might give you medicine for a condition you have that sort of deals with the symptoms, but you're dealing with this thing in your life that is also giving you this condition. It's never just about the symptoms that they drew a boundary around and called it that condition. They're making a cut there. Also, economic systems make cuts to measure how the economy is doing. Paid labor is included. Unpaid labor, like housework and care work, excluded. Companies' rising profits, included. How the workers are being treated, excluded. How people experience the economy is excluded when we say the economy is doing great, because of where we make that cut for how we determine how the economy is doing. So all actions are always in relationship with so many other actions. Agency can't be fully understood when we individualize it. Agency is something that we all share together with other humans and our environment. And this isn't to say individual responsibility and accountability don't matter. I'm saying individual responsibility and accountability are always inseparably entangled with a wider responsibility and accountability. What makes someone choose to be responsible and accountable for their actions are in response to other actions and will result in other actions. And so I just wanted to give you that very, very brief, surfacey description of this concept of agency and agential cuts, because it really makes me think a lot differently about our actions, our agency, our responsibility, what we're doing. And now, back to Jesus. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Try to look at it now with some of this different perspective we've been talking about. You can say that Jesus was crucified by a group of individuals, a group of individual Roman soldiers who tortured him and put his body on the cross. But you can also say that Jesus was crucified by a system, the system of the Roman Empire that maintained power through violence. When we widen our view of agency, we can see that the empire killed Jesus. Those soldiers didn't crucify Jesus on their own. They crucified Jesus because they were entangled with a system in a way where they acted on the system's behalf. And everyone who was there and who saw Jesus crucified was also part of that system. Even the people who were also victims of that system. Even the people who rebelled against that system. But their actions, all of their actions, the actions of every single one of them, were still tied to the actions of everyone else. Their responsibility to go along with the system or to rebel against the system was tied to the responsibility of everyone else choosing to go along with it or to rebel against it. You can look at all these people whose actions were determined by the system and say, these people aren't really separate individual selves making random choices. Their decisions are tied to the decisions of everyone else, and they're incapable of ever fully understanding all the actions that led up to their actions. They don't really know what they're doing. Or at least they're incapable of fully understanding every single aspect of what they're doing. Just like all of us. Jesus sees all of that from the cross, surrounded by people acting on behalf of the system and other people who were victims of it, all trying to figure out what to do. And how does Jesus respond? With grace. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And I think of today, as we face the violence of our own empire and of our own systems, and we try to think of what we can do. All our choices and all our actions are entangled with the actions and choices of everyone else and everything else. And we're not capable of fully grasping that. Or you could say, we at least will never fully know what we're doing. It's impossible. But agency still exists. I want to make that clear. Agency still exists. It's just that agency is something we share. And responsibility still exists. It's just that responsibility is something we share. So, through this very different perspective of Jesus on the cross on this Good Friday, I want you to think more about it after this episode. And I want you to think about this too. If you're feeling like you're not doing enough, or like you aren't doing enough to help others or to speak out for others, or like you're not knowledgeable enough to do what you want to do or to do what you feel like you need to do, or you feel like you're not morally good enough, or you feel like you're not enough in any way, I want you to have grace with yourself. Forgive yourself. Understand that your life is bigger than your individual decisions. And if you want to do more, then doing more will also be bigger than just your individual decisions. We can only fight the system together. And that fight involves all kinds of people doing all kinds of things together. And we never have to fully understand what we're doing, because we can't. But agency still exists. Responsibility still exists. You can still do. You could do more. You could do less. But have some grace with yourself too. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. That's how I'm seeing Jesus on the cross today. Happy Good Friday, everybody. Happy end of Lent. Hope you have a good weekend and good time this Easter. And I'll see y'all later. All right, cool. Bye-bye.